Hey, Mr. Hutch here, and we are on Chapter 7, Whipped Cream and Steel, in the book The Boys Who Challenged Hitler. Let's continue. By the spring of 1942, Aalborg, with its airport and harbor, had become a way station for many thousands of German soldiers headed to Norway to safeguard shipments of iron ore from Swedish mines to German factories. Remember, that's a big deal. They really want all that iron ore to build their weapons and vehicles, things like that. Hitler also used Aalborg as a place for German soldiers to rest and recover from battling the Soviet Union on the savage Eastern Front, where fighting had begun the previous summer. So this is a really popular place for the Germans. It could be a good hit point for our Churchill Club. The Eastern Front of World War II saw conflict on a colossal scale beginning in, here's a date for you, June 1941. When Hitler's army invaded Russia. The campaign pitted European Axis powers led by Germany and Finland against the Soviet Union, Poland, Norway, and other Allied forces. It was the largest scale military confrontation in history. There were ferocious battles marked by wholesale destruction and immense loss of life due to combat, starvation, exposure, disease, and massacres. Of the estimated 70 million deaths attributed to World War II, over 30 million, including civilians, occurred on the Eastern Front. Any German soldier pulled from the Eastern Front to rest and recover in Aalborg had to count his blessings. Day by day, German soldiers streamed in and out of the city. Many were bound for Norway, sleeping for a few nights in makeshift barracks, set up in schools and churches until they were ordered onto transport ships. Each soldier was armed, and each weapon was now an object of interest to the Churchill Club. The boys in the club soon found they were just as good at stealing weapons as they were at arson. Arson is burning stuff. Getting guns was no trick at all, one of the boys later recalled. We'd accost, good vocabulary word, we'd accost soldiers after a parade or at a railway station, and while a couple of us engaged them in friendly conversation, the others would steal the rifles they'd propped against a wall or bench. Here's Knud Peterson speaking. Day by day, our arsenal, another vocab word for you, arsenal. Day by day, our arsenal of stolen knives, guns, and bayonets grew. We hid them in the monastery basement and went down to check on them all the time. Our parents never caught on. Mother and father were alarmed by my sliding grades, but they were happy to see me make new friends and probably took it as a good sign that we all spent so much time at the monastery rather than at someone else's house. So, picture this. They literally, in the basement of their house, they have this, stash of weapons. And, just imagine your family if, you had a whole stash of weapons somewhere and they had no clue. That's how this is. It's crazy. Germans kept arriving in Aalborg. The rows of their vehicles that lined the streets grew longer and longer. They seized the best hotels in town, the Hotel Phoenix as their command center. At the docks, we observed hundreds of German soldiers marching down to Aalborg harbor and lowering themselves into the bottoms of old freight ships bound for Norway. As much as we hated the Germans, it was hard not to have a little feeling for the common soldiers heading off to battle. Many of them didn't seem much older than us. When a ship was fully loaded, a net was stretched over the top of the hull so that bodies wouldn't come to the surface if the vessel was sunk by torpedoes from British submarines, lying in wait just beyond the Limfjorden. In fact, it became unpopular to eat hornfish, which were green because it was said that they got their color from drowned German soldiers in green uniforms. We spent a lot of time at the dock, straddling our bikes, arms folded on our handlebars, squinting out like hawks for weapons left unguarded by German soldiers boarding their ships. Sometimes soldiers would lay their weapons on the ground within our reach, and we'd snatch them like gulls after crumbs. Their naval officers were always waving their arms and shouting at us to scram, but they never shot at us. We would flee full speed and come back in due time. The focus on weapons simplified our work. We knew what we were after. We became bolder. One day, a few of us saw a German officer's car roll to a stop in the middle of a downtown street. The exasperated driver jumped out of the cabin and stormed around front to crank the engine back into life. As he was cranking, Borga ran to the open car door, grabbed his bayonet dangling from a peg inside, and walked away. It wasn't just small weapons we were after. We had big eyes, too. One evening, several of us circled over the Limfjorden Bridge to Noresundby with the goal of destroying an anti-aircraft cannon. The Germans called it a flak cannon. It was boldly positioned on the harbor embankment, its great long barrel always thrust toward the sky for all to see. But for all its self-importance, it wasn't guarded at night. Our plan was to hoist it out of its box-like foundation, carry it down to the docks, and heave it into the Limfjorden. So they live on one side of the bridge, and Noresundby is on the other side of the bridge, and that's where this cannon is. And so they want to lift it up and throw it into the river, basically. There's a picture of the German planes over the Limfjorden. We had gotten it up out of its box and had just become comfortable with the weight of it when we heard our guard whistle. We dropped the monster and scattered. The threat turned out to be an ordinary Danish cyclist. Chewing out our guard for alerting us for so little, we returned to the box and lifted the cannon again. Staggering, we got it about halfway down to the dock before we heard another whistle. This time, it was a German guard, and we could see the barrel of his rifle sticking out of his pack as he carefully made his rounds. That was it. We dropped the cannon and pranced away toward our bikes, swearing loudly at the Germans and using crowbars and hammers to smash the windows of their buildings as we left. He heard us, of course, and gave us chase. He turned out to be in great shape. We ran for our lives, ditching our bikes, with the guard bellowing at us to halt and firing shots in the air. That night, we stayed in Noresundby rather than risk the bridge, and the next morning, we sneaked back to retrieve our bikes. All right, here's a little break in setting. Late in March, the boys stole several hundred cartridges for their new rifle from a cargo delivery truck at the train depot. By far the best place to find ammunition. They continued to take pistols and bayonets from loosely attended touring cars and open-windowed barracks. All right, here's Knud Peterson speaking again. Restaurants were the ripest pickings of all. The Germans had free run of downtown Aalborg, and they really took it over. Booted, helmeted, and heavily armed, they shopped for meat, vegetables, wine, and tobacco alongside ordinary Danes. It was hard to be at ease around them in a small shop or to defend your position in line against armed goons. Merchants who sold to them were reveled by many as traitors. Reveled? Good vocab word for you. These storekeepers didn't care. There was money to be made. So this is a good example of some storekeepers are actually fine with them being here. It's allowing them to make a lot of money. Our occupiers were crazy about the local taverns and restaurants. Danes are famous for their pastries. And German officers soon discovered the konditori pastry shop, Christine, regarded as the finest in Aalborg. Christine was famous throughout the sea for light, delicious whipped cream cakes. Men of the Third Reich removed their hats, hung up their coats and weapons in the cloakroom, and settled into red padded sofas until they were called to their tables. The officers then slid into high-backed, upholstered wooden chairs, placed their orders, and smoothed fresh linen napkins over their laps. This surely beat the Eastern Front. There's a picture of the pastry shop cafe there. One night, 4 of us slipped past the receptionist at the front door and found our way into Christine's unguarded coat room at the top of a staircase. Hanging on the racks was a jungle of fine woolen coats, sleeves sticking out. Hats rested on the shelf above. Some commanders had draped their holstered belts over the hooks as well. It was our great hope that some holsters would still contain German pistols, called Lugers. 2 of us took one side of the closet to the other, thrashing through the heavy wool waistcoats as fast as we could. Every now and then someone would find a gun belt with an empty holster, but success was elusive. Good vocabulary word, elusive. The others had already gone back outside when my fingers came to rest around a gleaming black pistol. I was turning it over and over in my hands when I felt someone pushing through the coat sleeves in my direction. I slipped the gun into my pocket and backed out past a German officer with a polite smile and a little bow. I was gone before he could react. Moments later, I was surrounded by the other 3 Churchill clubbers out in the street. What happened? Only this. I said. One by one, they thrust their hands into my pocket and felt the grand prize. When we got back to the monastery, I tossed the shiny black Luger and 2 full magazines onto the table. All right, change in who's speaking. The club's biggest triumph of all came as a matter of good luck and persistence. One afternoon, the boys were riding out by the harbor when Knud noticed 2 Germans standing on an observation platform and looking out at the harbor through binoculars. About 50 meters behind them was a barracks building with a couple of open windows. Knud skirted behind them and pedaled up closer to the building. There, through the open windows, was a machine gun in plain view on a cot. The boys had no automatic weapons, so this would be a new dimension. In many ways, the job looked like the rifle heist, but there were important differences. All right, back to Knud speaking. Knud Peterson. Even from a distance, the machine gun looked way too heavy and bulky to transport on a bike. Also, the 2 lookout soldiers were dangerously close to the barracks, but at least we could see where they were. Borga and I returned to the monastery and got a 3-wheeled bicycle with a cart on the back. We pedaled it back to the harbor and ditched it as close to the barracks building as we could. Then I went through the open window and handed the heavy semi-automatic weapon out to Borga. I was about to climb out when I noticed 2 canvas bags in the room, one bigger than the other. I figured the heavy one must contain the ammunition, so I passed it out too, and we took off. We got down to the bottom of the hill, and then we crashed the 3-wheeler, spilling the gun onto the road. We looked up behind us, terrified, but the soldiers were still intently focused on the harbor. We took the stuff to a nearby Boy Scout hut and emptied the contents of the bag. The gun was magnificent, and there were many bullets. But there was one problem. There was no magazine. The chamber that holds a supply of cartridges to be fed automatically to the gun. Without a magazine, the bullets could not be delivered to the weapon, and the bloody thing was useless. At our after-school meeting, there were howls of laughter. "Great resistance men you are!" There's a picture of the gun they stole. "Just what we need, a bullet collection." But it brought to light, once again, a naked truth. We have no experience with weapons. Most of us didn't even know what a magazine was. We decided that it was unsafe to go back for the magazine since they'd surely be on the lookout for whoever stole the weapon. We'd have to chalk this up as to experience. But I couldn't stand it. I went back the following day and snatched the other canvas bag, which indeed contained the magazines. There was also a coffee cup in the room that hadn't been there the day before, and a box with the word Krautkasten written on it. I figured Krautkasten meant gunpowder, or something. I grabbed it too, and hauled it back to the monastery. When we pried it open, hearts racing, we found dirty underwear. Krautkasten was the name of the soldier who lived in the room. Gross. All right, back to the narrator now. Here's a date to record down. By mid-April 1942, the club had amassed an arsenal of knives, bayonets, good vocab for you, amassed. The club had amassed an arsenal of knives, bayonets, pistols, rifles, and of course, the machine gun. With no military training and with no one to trust, the boys all struggled to learn to shoot. Here's Knud Peterson speaking. "Each Sunday morning, Jens and I practiced shooting the guns in a gigantic open loft at the top of the monastery during Father's church service. We would lie on our stomachs, waiting for the organ music to swell, and when it did, we'd blast away, firing at targets positioned in the hay on the other side of the loft. The machine gun was a Schmeisser, a weapon that German forces had used to shoot thousands of innocent people during the war. It came with a tripod. A setting allowed you to fire one shot at a time, which was helpful in our circumstance, when a hymn could suddenly subside or end altogether." So here they are. His dad's in church, and when the church people sing and the organ plays, then his son is shooting weapons upstairs in the loft. We never tired of handling the weapons. Several times, shots discharged by accident while we were just messing around in someone's room, nearly ending it all for one or more of us. Eigel actually put a bullet through his trousers one afternoon in Jens's room. Luckily, the bullet missed his leg, and there was no one from the rest of our family home to hear the explosion. By the end of April, we had 20 weapons in all and 432 bullets. We divided up the bullets. I got 112. We always had pistols in our pocket now when we went out on our missions, but these weapons were returned to the monastery at the end of the day. One of our main rules was that no one could take a weapon into school. Probably a good rule. We knew that if police ever caught us with German weapons, it would be over. After a while, it seemed insane to keep the entire arsenal in one place. We decided to divide the cash, stashing part of it in the monastery and part somewhere far away. Helga Milo, who lived in the nearby suburb of Norrsunby, volunteered to keep some of the weapons in his family's garden. So Helga is one of their friends from Cathedral, but he lives on the other side of the bridge across the fjord, closer to the airport there. So it's a great location for them to hide things, and just a great friend to have because he's on the other side of the bridge. It was an appealing idea, except that somehow we would have to transport the weapons across the Limfjorden Bridge with its guard checkpoints at both ends. The one we had crossed to do the Fuchs job at the airport a month or so before. No one could come up with a better plan, so one evening we packed Helga with weapons from the monastery, taping pistols to his torso and stuffing his clothing with ammunition. When we were done, we stood back and looked at him. You could see the outline of a rifle through his trouser leg. The machine gun was under his buttoned jacket, causing him to bend almost double over the handlebars when he got on his bike. The ammunition was concealed in boxes beneath a coat on the luggage rack. It was the best we could do. We posted 3 Churchill clubbers on either side of the bridge. Nervously, we at the monastery pushed Helga off and watched him weave his way toward the bridge, his first wobbly strokes making him look like a child just learning to ride. From time to time, he had to get off the bike and walk a few steps with the rifle stiffened legs. It was clumsy for him to reboard. This didn't look good. What would happen when he got to the heavily guarded bridge? What if he was asked for an identity card and searched? Somehow, he cleared the first checkpoint. The 3 clubbers awaited him at the Norrsunby side and first mocked his hunched-over position and stiff leg as he approached. But their laughter died quickly as they, too, realized this was a serious and perhaps decisive matter. The Churchill Club trios at both ends of the Limfjorden Bridge held their collective breath as our comrade Helga, packed hard-won assets, tottered up to the second guard station on the far side, paused, and was waved on. Somehow he had made it. There's a picture Canute of art supplies cluttered in his room. You can take a look at. All right, and that's the end of Chapter 7. On to Chapter 8, An Evening Alone.